Sweat stained the collar of his cheapest dress shirt. A heavy baby carrier dug relentlessly into his shoulders. He was a walking punchline in a room suffocating with silk and Rolexes. They snickered, assuming he was weak. They didn't know the cold woman across from him literally owned the building. Condensation dripped down the side of Julianne's water glass, pooling on the starched white linen. She dragged a manicured fingernail through the moisture, feeling the sharp chill of the ice through the thin crystal. She hated blind dates. She hated the forced small talk, the inevitable posturing. The moment the man sitting across from her realized she ran a multinational logistics firm and immediately tried to overcompensate by explaining his mid-level management role in excruciating detail. Tonight was supposed to be a favor to her sister. Just 1 hour, Viv. He's normal. You need normal. Normal, apparently, was running 18 minutes late. Julianne checked her watch. It was a vintage Cartier, heavy and silent. The restaurant, L'Orangerie, hummed around her. It smelled of roasted bone marrow, reduction sauces, and the sharp chemical tang of expensive dry cleaning. It was a place designed to make people feel small if they didn't belong. Julianne didn't just belong. She held the lease. She was about to signal the waiter for the check when the heavy mahogany front doors pushed open. A man stumbled in. He didn't glide past the maitre d' like the hedge fund managers and tech heirs that usually populated the lobby. He tripped slightly on the thick Persian rug, catching himself with a heavy, awkward step. Julianne's breath hitched, not out of attraction, but sheer, unadulterated shock. He was broad-shouldered, but his posture was completely ruined by the faded grey baby carrier strapped over his chest. Inside the carrier, a small head covered in fine, wispy hair bobbed against his sternum. He was wearing a navy blue suit that looked like it had been bought off the rack 5 years ago. The lapel was creased. There was a faint, chalky white smudge on his right shoulder. He looked frantically around the dimly lit dining room, his eyes scanning the tables. They were tired eyes. Deep, dark bags hung beneath them, bruised with exhaustion. The maitre d', a man named Henri, who usually treated Julianne with fawning reverence, stepped in front of the newcomer. Julianne couldn't hear the exchange, but she saw the rigid set of Henri's shoulders. She saw the man point toward her table. Henri's face contorted into a mask of polite horror. The man walked toward her. With every step, a faint, rhythmic squeak came from his left shoe. Julianne sat perfectly still. She didn't adjust her posture. She didn't offer a reassuring smile. She just watched as he stopped at the edge of her table. Julianne. His voice was a low rasp. It sounded like he had spent the last week swallowing sand. Thomas, she replied. He stood there for a second too long. He looked down at the baby, then back up at her, then at the empty plush chair opposite her. He exhaled, a long, defeated sound, and began the complicated process of sitting down without waking the infant strapped to his chest. He knocked his knee against the heavy oak table. The silverware rattled. I know, Thomas said, before she could utter a word. He unclipped a massive, overstuffed diaper bag from his shoulder and let it drop to the floor. It hit the hardwood with a dense thud that drew annoyed glances from the adjacent booth. The sitter bailed. Not just bailed, actually. Ghosted. I had 20 minutes to decide whether to cancel on you or bring her. He looked up at Julianne. His jaw was tight. I haven't been on a date in 3 years. I didn't want to cancel. Julianne looked at the baby. It was sound asleep, a tiny bubble of saliva forming and popping on its lips. Then she looked back at Thomas. The smell of him reached her across the table. It wasn't cologne. It was a mixture of sterile baby wipes, stale coffee, and the sharp, sour tang of nervous sweat. "You brought an infant," Julianne stated. Her tone was completely flat. "To l'orangerie." "I know," he repeated, rubbing a hand over his face. His knuckles were red and calloused. "I realize it looks like a hostage situation." Julianne didn't laugh. She studied him. He wasn't apologizing. Not really. There was no cowering in his posture, despite the obvious humiliation of his entrance. He was just surviving the moment. A waiter materialized out of the shadows, holding a leather-bound menu like a shield. He looked at the baby carrier, then at Julianne, a silent question in his eyes. "Do you want me to throw him out?" "Water for now," Julianne said, breaking eye contact with Thomas to glare at the waiter. "And bring a high chair, or whatever it is you have for this situation." "We do not have high chairs, madam," the waiter said, his nose lifting a fraction of an inch. "Then figure it out," she snapped. The waiter vanished. Thomas shifted in his seat. "You didn't have to do that. She stays in the carrier. If I unstrap her, she wakes up, and if she wakes up, the decibel level in here is going to double." "Your sister," Julianne started, choosing her words carefully, "told me you were a high school teacher. She failed to mention you were navigating single fatherhood as an extreme sport." "My sister," Thomas muttered, picking up his cloth napkin and staring at it as if he didn't know what it was for, "is an optimist. My wife passed away 14 months ago. Complications during the pregnancy." The air between them seemed to suddenly freeze. Julianne felt a cold prickle at the base of her neck. She was used to hostile boardrooms. She was used to men screaming at her over missed quarterly projections. She knew how to dismantle a rival corporation with a smile. She did not know what to do with a man sitting in a Michelin star restaurant, smelling like spit-up, casually dropping a devastating tragedy onto the white tablecloth. "I am sorry for your loss," Julianne said. The words tasted metallic and rehearsed. "Thank you," Thomas said. He didn't look up. He just started gently bouncing his leg, a rhythmic motion that swayed the sleeping baby. "Her name is Maya." "Maya," Julianne repeated. For the next 10 minutes, they existed in a painful, agonizing silence, punctuated only by the clinking of heavy silverware and the hushed, arrogant murmurs of the dining room. Julianne drank her water. Thomas stared at the menu, his eyes tracing the French words without actually reading them. He was out of his depth. He was drowning in it. And Julianne, for reasons she couldn't entirely explain, found herself unable to look away from the wreck. The appetizers arrived as a masterclass in culinary pretension. Foam, reduction drops, microgreens placed with surgical tweezers. Thomas looked at the slate plate placed in front of him. It contained 3 scallops, each no larger than a quarter. He picked up his fork, the heavy silver looking absurdly large, in his large, calloused hand. As he raised a scallop to his mouth, Maya woke up. It wasn't a slow, peaceful awakening. It was immediate. Her tiny fists clenched, her face scrunched into a tight red knot, and she let out a sharp, reedy wail. Thomas froze. The scallop dropped off his fork, bounced off the edge of the slate plate, and landed squarely on the lapel of his suit jacket. It left a glistening trail of brown butter sauce before falling onto his thigh. He didn't even look at the stain. He dropped the fork. It clattered loudly against the slate. Shh, shh, shh. Maya, hey, look at me, Thomas whispered, his voice dropping an octave, frantic and soothing all at once. He unbuckled the top strap of the carrier, pulling the squirming infant out and resting her against his shoulder. He began to bounce in his chair, patting her back with heavy, rhythmic thuds. The sound of the crying cut through the restaurant's engineered ambience like a chainsaw. Conversations stopped. Heads turned. At the table next to theirs sat a group of 4 men in their late 20s. They wore unbuttoned designer shirts and had the distinct, flush-faced look of men who were on their 3rd bottle of expensive wine, paid for by a corporate expense account. Jesus Christ, one of them muttered loudly. He had slicked back blonde hair and a chin that looked weak despite the expensive shave. Is this a Chuck E. Cheese now? His companions chuckled. The sound was wet and mean. Julianne's spine went rigid. She didn't look at the men. She looked at Thomas. His face was flushed. Sweat was beading on his forehead. He was digging frantically into the massive diaper bag with one hand while holding the wailing baby with the other. He pulled out a bottle, a plastic container of pre-measured formula powder, and a thermos. His hands were shaking. He tried to unscrew the thermos one-handed, gripping the base between his knees. The cap popped off violently, splashing warm water onto the pristine tablecloth. Damn it, Thomas hissed under his breath. He dumped the powder into the bottle, spilling a third of it. Fine. White dust drifted over the scallops and settled onto the table. He screwed the nipple onto the bottle and shook it aggressively, then brought it to Maya's mouth. She rejected it. She turned her head away and screamed louder, arching her back. Oh, come on, buddy, please, Thomas begged. His voice cracked. It was a horrible, broken sound. He wasn't embarrassed anymore. He was panicked. He was failing in public. The blonde man at the next table laughed openly now. He raised his wineglass in a mock toast. Hey, buddy, you want me to cut your meat for you too? Maybe burp you. More laughter. Loud. Unabashed. Julianne felt a physical sensation in her chest. It wasn't pity. Pity was a useless, passive emotion. It was rage, hot, sudden, and blindingly bright. She looked at Thomas. He had completely shut down the outside world. He was hunched over, his broad shoulders curling inward, as if he could physically shield his daughter from the stares and the mockery. He grabbed a cloth napkin and started wiping at the spilled powder, smearing it into a paste with the spilled water. It was a chaotic, hopeless mess. He was trying so hard to shrink, to disappear. Julianne knew men who would throw a tantrum if their steak was undercooked. She dealt with billionaires who threw cell phones at assistants because their private flights were delayed by wind. And here was this man, covered in butter sauce and baby formula, vibrating with exhaustion, absorbing the mockery of strangers just so his kid wouldn't starve. Hey, Julianne said. Her voice was sharp. Thomas didn't hear her over Maya's crying. He was rocking back and forth. I know. He kept whispering to the baby. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. The blonde man spoke up again, leaning over the back of his chair, invading their space. Seriously, pal, you're ruining a $200 steak for me. Take the kid to a diner where you belong. Sucks that your old lady left you holding the bag, but don't make it our problem." The restaurant went completely silent. Even the soft jazz playing through the hidden speakers seemed to mute itself. The waiters stood frozen against the walls. Thomas stopped rocking. He slowly pulled the bottle away from Maya's mouth. She whimpered, but the sudden cessation of movement confused her enough that she quieted down, hiccuping softly against his shoulder. Thomas looked at the puddle of milky water on the table. He looked at the butter stain on his suit. He carefully, agonizingly slowly, lowered Maya back into the carrier strapped to his chest. He clicked the buckles. They made a sharp plastic snap in the dead silence of the room. He took a deep breath. His chest shuddered. Julianne braced herself. She expected him to apologize. She expected him to grab the bag, lower his head, and run out the door. It was the natural human response to public humiliation. Fight or flight. And Thomas looked like a man who hadn't had the energy to fight in over a year. But Thomas didn't reach for the bag. He placed his hands flat on the table. His knuckles were white. The ink stains on his fingers stood out starkly against the white linen. He pushed his chair back. The legs scraped loudly against the hardwood floor. And then Thomas Weaver stood up. He didn't rise with the dramatic, explosive energy of a movie hero. It was a slow, heavy ascent. His left knee popped loudly. The weight of the baby carrier made his posture pitch slightly forward, but he planted his feet wide to steady himself. He was 6'2". From a seated position, hunched over a crying infant, he had looked small. Standing up, with his shoulders pulled back and his jaw locked, he took up a terrifying amount of space. He turned slowly to face the adjacent table. The four men looked up at him. The blond man's smirk faltered slightly, but he leaned back in his chair, attempting to project bored confidence. Thomas didn't yell. When he spoke, his voice was frighteningly calm. It was the voice of a man who had been pushed past the limits of adrenaline, past anger, straight into the cold, dense vacuum of absolute fatigue. "My old lady," Thomas said, the words heavy and deliberate, "did not leave me holding the bag. She died. She bled out on an operating table while I held her hand." The blond man swallowed hard. His Adam's apple bobbed. The smirk vanished entirely. "I have not slept for more than 3 consecutive hours in 8 months, Thomas continued. He took a single half-step closer to their table. The baby carrier shifted. Maya looked around with wide, blinking eyes. "I wake up at 4 in the morning to grade history papers. I mash bananas. I boil bottles. I go to work. I come home. I do it alone. Every single day." He pointed a thick, calloused finger at the blond man's half-empty wine glass. "I don't have a corporate card. I saved up for 2 months to afford the entrees on this menu. I bought this suit for a funeral." Thomas's voice began to shake. Not with fear. The emotion was bleeding through the cracks in his composure, raw and jagged. "I came here tonight because my sister told me I needed to remember what it was like to be a human being, to have a conversation, to pretend just for an hour that I wasn't drowning." He looked at the other 3 men at the table. None of them met his gaze. They stared at their plates, at their shoes, at the expensive centerpieces. "I know I smell like sour milk. I know I'm a mess. I know my daughter is loud." Thomas's hands balled into fists at his sides. "But I haven't quit. I haven't abandoned her. And I am doing the absolute best I can." He leaned down, bringing his face inches from the blond man. who was now pressed rigidly back against his chair. "So before you complain about your steak," Thomas whispered, the rasp in his voice echoing in the dead quiet of the restaurant, "you should ask yourself if you possess a fraction of the spine it takes to walk into a room like this, knowing exactly how pathetic you look and refusing to hide anyway." Silence. Complete, suffocating silence. The clinking of glasses had stopped. The hum of the kitchen seemed miles away. Every patron, every waiter, the maitre d', they were all frozen in place. Thomas stared the man down for 3 agonizing seconds. Then the tension broke. Thomas exhaled. His shoulders slumped. The fire went out of him as quickly as it had ignited, leaving him looking hollowed out and grey. He turned back to Julianne's table. He didn't look at her. He couldn't. He reached down and grabbed the strap of the massive diaper bag. He hoisted it over his shoulder. It looked like it weighed 100 pounds. "I'm sorry," Thomas said to Julianne. He stared at a spot on the table right next to the spilled formula. "I've ruined your evening. I'm going to leave now." He turned toward the door. Julianne felt her heart hammering against her ribs. The sensation was entirely foreign. She had watched corporate titans scream at each other. She had seen hostile takeovers orchestrated with vicious precision. She had never, in her 34 years, witnessed anything as profoundly powerful as the broken, messy, unapologetic honesty of the man walking away from her. "Thomas," she said. He stopped, but he didn't turn around. Julianne stood up. She smoothed the skirt of her custom-tailored dress. She looked at the maitre d', who was standing near the back wall, pale and wide-eyed. "Henri," Julianne called out. Her voice was crisp. It commanded the room effortlessly. Henri scrambled forward. "Yes, madame." "Bring a damp cloth to clean up this formula," she ordered. She didn't look at Henri. She kept her eyes on Thomas's back. "Bring a new glass of water, and bring a bottle of the 2009 Margot." Henri blinked. "Right away, madame." Julianne finally turned her gaze to the table of 4 men. The blonde man was staring at his lap, looking nauseous. "As for them," Julianne said, her voice dropping to a temperature that could snap steel, "put their entire check on my personal tab, and then throw them out." The blonde man's head snapped up. "Excuse me, you can't—" "I own the building," Julianne interrupted. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't have to. "I own the management company that leases this space. I can, and I will, have you trespassed. Leave, now." The 4 men scrambled. It was an ugly, frantic exit. They grabbed their coats, stumbling over their chairs, avoiding eye contact with everyone in the room. They practically ran for the double mahogany doors. Julianne watched them go. Then she turned back to Thomas. He had turned around. He was looking at her, his expression a chaotic mixture of confusion, exhaustion, and wary disbelief. Maya was asleep again, against his chest. Julianne stepped around the table. She walked up to him. Up close, the smell of baby wipes and stale coffee was even stronger. She realized she didn't mind it. It smelled real. She reached out and gently pulled the heavy diaper bag off his shoulder. She let it drop to the floor. "Sit down, Thomas," Julianne said softly. It wasn't an order. It was an invitation. "The wine is on its way, and you're going to tell me exactly how you mash those bananas." Henri returned like a phantom, stepping softly onto the hardwood to avoid drawing further attention. He held the bottle of 2009 Chateau Margaux with a reverence usually reserved for religious artifacts. He poured a small amount into Julianne's glass, the dark liquid swirling like bruised velvet against the crystal. She didn't taste it. She simply nodded. Henri filled her glass, then moved to Thomas, pouring a generous measure before retreating into the shadows of the dining room. Thomas stared at the wine. It smelled of dark plum, wet cedar, and something faintly metallic. He reached out with a thick, calloused hand, his knuckles still bearing a faint dusting of white chalk from a blackboard, and wrapped his fingers around the delicate stem. It looked absurdly fragile in his grip. "You didn't have to pay for them," Thomas said. His voice was lower now, the adrenaline spike from his outburst bleeding away, leaving a husky rasp. "And you certainly didn't have to order this. I teach 10th grade European history. My palate peaks at whatever red is on sale at Trader Joe's." "I didn't order it for your palate," Julianne replied, taking a slow sip. The wine was heavy, structured, and perfect. "I ordered it because I wanted a good glass of wine, and because watching those insufferable private equity clones scramble out of my restaurant was the most entertaining thing I've seen all quarter." Thomas let out a short, dry breath that might have been a laugh if it had any joy in it. He took a drink. His eyebrows twitched upward in surprise as the complex, layered vintage hit his tongue, but he quickly masked it, setting the glass down next to the spilled formula paste. "They lease space in my building," Julianne continued, her voice remarkably level, almost clinical. "Third floor, a boutique firm that specializes in aggressive leveraged buyouts. They strip struggling companies for parts and fire the employees. I've been looking for an excuse to break their lease. Now I have one." She wasn't bragging. She was stating facts. Julianne lived in a world of leverage, of calculated risks and brutal efficiencies. She assessed human beings the same way she assessed supply chains, looking for weak links, redundancies, points of failure. But Thomas Weaver was breaking her algorithm. "So," Julianne said, resting her forearms on the table. She ignored the condensation pooling near her elbows. "Bananas." Thomas blinked. "What?" "You said you mash bananas. My sister, Caroline, runs a non-profit. She employs an army of nannies for her twins. I've never seen her mash a piece of fruit in her life. Explain it to me." He looked at her, searching her face for mockery. He found none, just a sharp, unyielding curiosity. "You take a fork," Thomas said slowly, as if speaking to someone who had just landed from Mars. "You put a banana in a bowl, and you crush it until a toothless human can swallow it without choking. It sounds tedious." "It is." Thomas leaned back, the leather of the booth creaking under his weight. Maya shifted against his chest, letting out a soft sigh. He instinctively brought a hand up to rest on her small back. The rhythmic squeak of his left shoe started again, a subconscious soothing mechanism. "It's entirely tedious. It's also sticky. It gets under your fingernails. And half the time, she spits it right back out onto my shirt." He gestured to the fresh butter stain from the scallop, then to an older, faintly yellow stain near his collar. "Why not buy the jars?" Julianne asked. "The processed puree. It's more efficient." "Because Sarah." Thomas stopped. The name caught in his throat like a fishhook. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing sharply. He closed his eyes for a fraction of a second. "My wife, Sarah. She read a book about preservatives. She wanted to do everything fresh. She bought all these little glass containers. She had a whole system planned out for when the baby started solid foods. He opened his eyes. They were completely dry, but the grief in them was so loud Julianne could almost hear it. She didn't get to use the system, Thomas said softly. So, I mashed the bananas. It's inefficient. It takes 20 minutes I don't have. But it's what she wanted. Julianne felt a strange, tight sensation behind her ribs. It wasn't pity. She despised pity. It felt more like a structural fracture. A tiny crack in the load-bearing walls she had spent a decade building around herself. In her world, when a system failed, you discarded it. You optimized. If a partner died, you liquidated the assets and moved on. You didn't hold on to a broken, inefficient process out of loyalty to a ghost. I see, Julianne said quietly, and for the first time in a very long time, she meant it. They sat in silence for a while, drinking the $2,000 wine amidst the ruins of a ruined dinner. The tension in the air had fundamentally changed. It was no longer the prickly, defensive energy of a disastrous blind date. It had settled into something heavier, something grounded in the messy, unfiltered reality of survival. Maya began to squirm, not the frantic thrashing of hunger, but the slow, uncomfortable shifting of a baby who needed to be adjusted. Thomas sighed, putting his wineglass down. Here we go. The carrier is digging into her legs. He unbuckled the chest strap with practiced, one-handed efficiency. He hoisted the baby out, supporting her wobbly neck, and sat her on his knee. Maya was awake now. She had big, startlingly blue eyes and a spray of wispy brown hair that stuck up in erratic tufts. She wore a tiny, faded, yellow onesie that looked like it had been washed 100 times. She stared at Julianne. Julianne stared back. She didn't know what to do with children. They were unpredictable variables. They didn't respond to logic or authority. Maya suddenly slammed her tiny, wet fist onto the table. The heavy silver fork next to Thomas's plate rattled. She let out a loud, bubbly giggle. "Hey," Thomas chided gently, grabbing her hand. "No property damage. We're already on thin ice here." Maya ignored him. She lunged forward, her arms stretching across the white linen. Her fingers, sticky with saliva, brushed against the sleeve of Julianne's silk dress. Julianne froze. Thomas panicked. He yanked Maya back, a look of absolute horror crossing his face. "Oh God, Julianne, I'm so sorry. I'll pay for the dry cleaning. I didn't realize she could reach—" "Thomas, stop," Julianne said. Her voice was sharp, but not angry. She looked at her sleeve. There was a tiny, faint, wet spot on the expensive silk. She looked at the baby. Maya was grinning, a drooly, toothless smile that scrunched up her entire face. Slowly, Julianne reached her hand across the table. Her nails were perfectly manicured, painted a severe, glossy black. Her fingers were adorned with 2 rings that cost more than a suburban house. She extended her index finger toward the infant. Maya immediately grabbed it. The baby's grip was shockingly strong. Her skin was incredibly warm, almost feverish compared to the chilled, air-conditioned atmosphere of the restaurant. The contrast was jarring. Julianne felt a pulse of raw, biological heat transfer from the tiny hand into her own cold fingers. It was utterly uncalculated, utterly real. "She has a strong grip," Julianne noted, her voice dropping to a softer register. "She's a fighter," Thomas said. He was watching Julianne carefully. the exhaustion in his eyes momentarily replaced by a quiet, protective pride. Born 6 weeks early, spent a month in the NICU. She knows how to hold on. Julianne looked up from the baby to meet his gaze. She saw the dark circles, the poorly fitting suit, the chalk dust. But she also saw the immense, immovable architecture of his devotion. He was holding up a collapsing roof with his bare hands, and he was doing it without asking for a medal. Caroline was wrong, Julianne said softly. Thomas frowned. About what? She said you were a high school teacher. Julianne gently pulled her finger back. Maya let go with a soft, protesting grunt. She didn't tell me you were made of iron. Thomas stared at her. A flush crept up his neck, coloring his cheeks. He wasn't used to compliments. He was used to being invisible, or worse, being a burden. He looked down at the table, rubbing the back of his neck with a heavy hand. I'm not iron, he muttered. Most days, I feel like I'm made of wet paper. Wet paper doesn't stand up to a table of corporate bullies while holding a baby, Julianne countered. She picked up her wine glass, finishing the last of the Margot. It takes a specific kind of arrogance to think you can handle this world alone, Thomas. I should know. I have that arrogance. But it takes something entirely different to admit you are drowning and still refuse to sink. Henri brought the check encased in a black leather folder. Julianne didn't even look at it. She slipped a black titanium credit card onto the silver tray. Thomas bristled, his spine stiffening. Julianne, no. I said I was paying. You couldn't afford the tax on this bottle, Thomas, she said bluntly. She didn't say it with malice. She said it like she was reading a quarterly report. Save your money for the bananas. He opened his mouth to argue, his pride flaring hot and stubborn. He hated charity. He hated feeling smaller than he already was. But he looked at her eyes, dark, calculating, yet strangely open, and the fight drained out of him. He was too tired for a pissing contest. Thank you, he said quietly. It tasted like ash, but he swallowed it. Don't thank me. Thank Henri. He had to clean up your formula. Julianne stood up. The movement was fluid, powerful. Thomas wrestled Maya back into the carrier. It was a clumsy, undignified process. He bumped his elbow against the table. He dropped a pacifier, cursing under his breath as he bent down to retrieve it, stuffing it blindly into his pocket. He hoisted the massive diaper bag onto his shoulder. They walked out of the dining room together. The silence left in their wake was heavy. Every eye in l'Orangerie followed them. The billionaire CEO in her custom silk, walking shoulder to shoulder with a battered, stained high school teacher carrying an infant. The heavy mahogany doors swung open, and the humid, exhaust-choked air of the city hit them like a wet towel. The street was dark, illuminated by the harsh, yellow glare of sodium streetlights. The smell of hot asphalt and distant garbage trucks replaced the truffle oil and expensive perfumes of the restaurant. It was loud. Taxis honked, brakes squealed, and a siren wailed somewhere in the distance. A sleek black Maybach silently rolled up to the curb. A driver in a sharp suit immediately stepped out, opening the rear door. "Good evening, Ms. Sterling," the driver said, his voice crisp. Julianne nodded. "Evening, David. Wait a moment." She turned to Thomas. He was standing a few feet away, looking completely out of place on the manicured sidewalk. The neon sign from a nearby bodega reflected off his tired eyes. "Where are you parked?" Julianne asked. Thomas pointed down the block, toward an alley where a faded, silver 2012 Subaru Outback was wedged between a delivery truck and a fire hydrant. The rear bumper was secured with a strip of duct tape. "Right there," he said. He shifted his weight, the baby carrier squeaking. "It's not much, but it gets the car seat from point A to point B." Julianne looked at the Subaru. She looked at the Maybach. In her world, everything was a transaction. You invested time and capital, and you expected a measurable return. What was the ROI on Thomas Weaver? He had no assets, no influence, no strategic value. He came with a mountain of baggage and a literal crying infant. He was a terrible investment. But as she looked at him standing under the street lamp, his broad shoulders stooped under the weight of his reality, the butter stain drying on his lapel, she felt an intense, irrational urge to know more, to see what happened when a man who refused to break finally got a chance to rest. "It was an absolute disaster," Thomas said, breaking the silence. He tried for a self-deprecating smile, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. "I ruined your dress. I ruined your dinner. I'm fairly certain I'm banned from this restaurant for life." "You are not banned," Julianne said. "I'll make sure Henri knows your face." "Great. So I can come back and order a glass of tap water while my daughter screams." He shifted the heavy bag on his shoulder. "Look, Julianne, you're formidable and terrifying and incredibly generous. But I know how this works. You don't have to do the polite brush-off. I'm going to go home, wash this suit, grade 30 essays on the French Revolution, and try not to fall asleep standing up. You're going to get in that car and go back to a universe that makes sense." He took a step backward. "It was nice meeting you." He turned to walk away. The squeak of his shoe sounded lonely over the din of the traffic. "Thomas." Her voice cut through the street noise like a scalpel. It was the voice that closed multi-million-dollar acquisitions. It demanded obedience. He stopped, turning back slowly. Julianne didn't reach for her purse. She didn't pull out one of her heavy, embossed business cards that listed her corporate headquarters and her assistant's extension. Instead, she took 3 steps toward him, closing the distance. She looked up at him. She was inches away. She could smell the stale coffee and the sour milk again. But beneath it, she smelled something else. Clean sweat, cedar, something inherently warm. "Caroline gave you my assistant's number," Julianne said. Her voice was low, meant only for him over the roar of a passing bus. "She did," Thomas confirmed, his brow furrowing in confusion. "Delete it." Julianne reached into her clutch, pulled out a sleek silver pen, and grabbed his right hand. He was too stunned to pull away. She uncapped the pen with her teeth and pressed the tip against the rough, calloused skin of his palm. She wrote 10 digits. The ink was cold against his skin. "That is my personal cell," Julianne said, capping the pen and dropping it back into her bag. "Only 4 people in the world have it. If you call it during business hours, I will likely ignore it. If you call it when I'm in a board meeting, I will send you to voicemail." She stepped back, her eyes locking onto his. "But," she continued, her tone softening just a fraction, "if you call it on a Sunday afternoon, when the essays are graded, when the bananas are mashed, when you have an hour to remember what it is like to be a human being." She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't have to. The air between them hummed, thick with an unspoken challenge and a terrifying vulnerability. Thomas stared at his palm. The black ink was stark against his rough skin. He slowly closed his fingers, curling his hand into a fist, protecting the numbers as if they might blow away in the wind. He looked up at her. The heavy, dead exhaustion in his eyes had fractured. A tiny, impossible spark of light had broken through. "Sunday," Thomas said. His voice was a gravelly whisper. "Sunday," Julianne confirmed. David closed the door with a solid, expensive thud. Through the tinted glass, Julianne watched Thomas Weaver. He didn't move immediately. He stood on the dirty sidewalk, the neon lights washing over him, clutching his hand to his chest right next to where his daughter slept. He looked down at the baby, then back toward the departing car. "Where to, Ms. Sterling?" David asked from the front seat, pulling the car smoothly into the traffic. "Home, David," Julianne said quietly. She looked down at her silk sleeve, at the tiny, faint, damp spot where a toothless infant had grabbed her. She reached over and touched it, tracing the invisible circle with her fingertip. She smiled. A real, imperfect, entirely uncalculated smile. "Just take me home. If this raw, real moment hits you hard, hit that like button and share it with someone who knows what it means to keep showing up when life gets heavy. To the single parents, the underdogs, and anyone fighting silent battles, this story is for you." Subscribe to our channel for more deeply grounded stories that skip the fairy tales and show the beautiful, messy truth of real life. Let us know in the comments, when did you fiercely defend your truth?